That was the best one, too.
Yeah.
That was a good collab.
You guys can start. Okay. Hello.
Hi.
First, thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview.
It's great to be here.
I'm really, and this has been really wonderful, and I'm really honored to be able to celebrate Audre's 80th birthday anniversary in this way.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you're going to, that you are a part of it. And
yeah, me too.
Melinda Goodman once said that you, along with Jonathan, are one of that Audre's children are her greatest creations. And I just thought that was just such a powerful and beautiful thing to say. And I've not met your brother, but just having the opportunity to get to know you, I really agree. And somebody who deeply loves Audre Lorde and all of her work, I'm like, yes. So,
well, thank you. Thanks for that.
Yes.
I think that being a mother was really important to her. And at the same time, as her child, growing up, I know that both my brother and I really did sort of feel pretty acutely. We were aware that she had work to do that had nothing to do with us. Although I wasn't really aware of that. I wasn't really very aware of all the work that she did in the world until, I read all of her books the summer I was 16. And I'd, been going to readings of hers. She would always take us to her readings. So we'd been going to those since I guess I was 4 and since I was 5 and Jonathan was 4. Because 68 was the year that she came out with First Cities. So, we were going to readings pretty much steadily from there. I don't really remember how often they were, but they were at least one every couple of months, and, times when there would be more. And then when we were a little bit older, like, grade school age, like I remember 4th, 5th grade, she was traveling more. And going to different colleges and reading. So we always knew that she was doing this work that had really, was sort of like bigger than us and also apart from us in a way. But I know that, she would tell us, and also, it was in her work that being a mother was really important to her. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, she was a good mother. She really was.
Well, that's what I wanted to definitely we are celebrating the Black lesbian feminist mother warrior poet, but just thinking about Audre as mother. And one of the things that we had the opportunity to discuss when you and Melinda Goodman had come to talk to my Audre Lorde class was just her as mother, and particularly with you and your brother, because what has happened with me, at least in my classes, in terms of seeing A Litany for Survival, just that award-winning, amazing film that feels kind of timeless with Audre, as well as...
Yeah, shout out to Ada Gaynor.
Yes, yeah.
And also Michelle Parkerson.
Yeah. No, they're really incredible. What I wanted to get to was just kind of your mom as mothering. You in Litany, you see a lot of interaction with you and she. Mm-hmm. And I think, and as a filmmaker, I know you got a film where people are, the only interactions that we see with Jonathan is by himself, right? Mm-hmm. So that people kind of make, we all create stories. So students have said, wow, she doesn't like men, and it's really clear she didn't even like her son. And so I just would like to yes. So I just want to kind of create, kind of just address that once and for all, because I think that really does that is something that has happened that I've read in papers from students, not only in my Audre, not necessarily my Audre Lorde class, but my Gay and Lesbian Lives class. It's really just kind of what was her relationship with her son,
Well, I can't speak for Jonathan.
Of course you can't.
He's his own man. I can only tell you what it looks like, from my point of view, and that, I guess it's funny when you're a public figure, people will make up these stories, right? Like this is a National Enquirer version of Audre Lorde. It's like, well, he's not with his mother. She must have hated men, so I.
Mm-hmm.
there were a lot of logistical reasons for that at the time. I mean, I know that for me, I got filmed for Litany for Survival in the late 1980s. And at that time, my brother was away. I mean, he'd graduated from college and become a naval officer. And he served in the first Gulf War. So, he was on an aircraft carrier for like 4 years, in naval intelligence. So, one of the reasons why, and my mom during those years was in St. Croix, largely. So I don't know when, I mean, my memory is that they shot him in New York, during one of his leaves. And they filmed me in St. Croix, where I'd gone to spend time, with Audre. So, there are real logistical reasons for that. From the outside looking in, I can, sort of say, because again, my brother and I have a close relationship, and I don't want to, sort of trample on his sense of privacy in any way, but I think it's fair to say, and I feel comfortable, saying this in a public forum. I mean, my mother loved both of us very, very much, but they were two extremely different relationships, and one of the things that was really operative, I think, in my mother and my brother's relationship is that they were very much alike. And, I mean, I'm a lot of things, but I don't think I really have the true Audre Lorde warrior spirit. I'm much more of a fish, like, confrontation coming, that kind of thing. And my brother's not like that at all. I mean, I can't speak to how he feels about confrontation, but he's not afraid of confrontation. And well, I don't know if I can even say that, because I don't live inside his skin. He might be afraid, but you're not going to know about it, And I think that was something that he had in common with our mother. And when two people are very much alike, their personal interactions have the potential to become a little more fraught than if they're really complementary, right? If one person is going to be, very forward going, and the other person is going to be a little bit more yielding, then that makes life a little bit easier than if both folks are very forward going and very forceful and, and brilliant, I might add. I mean, my brother is probably the smartest person I know. So, and anybody who has raised exceptionally bright children will tell you the smarter they are, the harder they are. So, yeah.
No, yeah. Thank you.
But the love was there, on both sides. I think in many ways, there were times when it wasn't easy for either one of them. But the love is there. Yeah.
No, I think that's so important, because people they just create stories that they don't make, uninformed stories, and I just really wanted to, kind of address that.
I mean, like I said, I'm not my brother, I can't speak for him, so maybe he might consider this a story too, but I have to say, as somebody who grew up, around them both, that's kind of how that looked to me. Yeah. It never ceases to amaze me how people will take from feminism or interpret feminism as this, distrust, dislike, or hate, negativity in any way toward men. Where in the same way that, true revolutionaries here in America are not revolutionaries because they hate America. They're revolutionaries because they love America. Right? That's what makes it worth it. right? Why
Right.
would you fight? Why would you expend the energy if you didn't believe in a dream that things can be better than they are and should be? And that's what feminism really is. You know, there's been more freedom for men that's come out of feminism than freedom for women. We're still paid 60 cents on the dollar, but men can stay home and raise those kids and actually find that they have real relationships with their children instead of looking around when the kids are like, 30 years old and all I got was to dance with her at her wedding. I mean, where's the relationship? Yeah, come in, kiss you in your hospital bed, daddy, I love you, and you had no relationship for 50 years. There's a lot less of that going on now.
So let's talk about what you can speak on in terms of your own. What was your relationship with Audre?
It was very close. Very close. When I say she was a great mother, I think that one of the hardest things in parenting is to truly want your children to be free. Like truly, deep down inside, not to see them as an extension of yourself, but to see them as their own being and to conduct yourself accordingly. That you are only stewarding them until they need no more stewarding and giving them whatever you can. That was my mother's approach to parenthood, like from get. So, and who knows, maybe it was because she was like an Aquarian, I don't know, maybe there were a lot of different things. But that's certainly not the parenting approach she grew up with. I mean, not at all. Not even a little. So, I don't know exactly how she developed that, but it's very kind of emotionally generous, wanting us to be our own people was how I experienced her. And I think that is hard because, as a parent, I think sometimes it's hard not to let your ego in. Even in ways that are kind of innocuous, like, your kid will act a certain way and you think, I wonder how that's reflecting on me, or, I kind of taught him better, or, I think that our mother really wanted us to be our own people. And she also made sure that she followed her own work in a way that made it, I think, a little bit easier for us to, when it was time to separate, it was a little easier, I think, to separate. Sometimes, teenagers feel guilty when they, go off or start to have their own friends or start to, you kind of feel guilty because you kind of feel like, oh, I'm leaving, and that guilt is fostered, oh, go on, don't worry about me, like parents will say that kind of thing. My mother and Frances really didn't do that to us at all, is my memory. Now, sometimes that was a little uncomfortable. I remember being maybe 12 or 11, and it was going to be New Year's Eve. And my mom said to my brother and I, so, what are your plans for New Year's Eve? And we're being here with you. I mean, we're like kids, right? Oh, because, Francis and I thought you might want to go hang out with your friends. Hang out with our friends, okay? We're kids. I'm like, no. And my mother said, well, because we've been invited to a couple of parties, but okay, if you want to stay here or whatever, we'll do a family thing. And I felt like, oh, well, okay. So we did a family thing, right? But it was always clear to us that, she had her own socializing and partying and whatever, and, we didn't have to feel guilty about doing our socializing or partying when that time came. it wasn't that year, when I was like 11 or 12 or something.
Mm-hmm. Did you have like turbulent, like a lot of, not quite a few, folks have these turbulent years with their parents.
Oh man,
and,
we had turbulent years for real. I didn't, I thought I was so nice. It's like, right? It was a real shock to me. I remember when my mother first said to me, you come in here like a storm cloud sometimes. I'm like, huh? Who? Me? I'm sweetness and light all the time. That's what I thought. I think I was 13 or 14 at the time. So we definitely had some stormy times. I mean, the summer that I was 16, I think I told you, she said to me, look, you are out of this house this summer because both of us will not be in this house this summer and both of us survive. So that means you have to go. And I'm going to send you to my friend Diane DePrima's house for the summertime. So I stayed at Diane's in San Francisco this summer that I was 16. Yeah, it was a really good experience. Yeah.
And that's when you read your mother's work?
Yeah, I was looking for something to read. I didn't have reading material with me. And Diane said, well, why don't you read some of your mother's books? They're right there in the hallway. Diane had this apartment. It was on Laguna and Page. I'll never forget that apartment. And there were books all over the place. And there was this long hallway. And on one side of the hallway, just shelf after shelf of, like, books. So my mom had a little section that was all to herself. And, I mean, at that point, let's see, it was 1979. And I think there were about nine books on the shelf. 8 books. Something like that. And I read them all. I read them all that summer.
Did she shift from being your mother to, she was always will be your mother, but, did you see her in a different light when you read the work?
I did. And a lot of the resentments that I'd kind of been brewing for a couple of years, I had a little bit more perspective on those. Because by the time that I was 16, my mom had been diagnosed with breast cancer, had gone through a mastectomy. This is before she was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer. But, her idea of unlimited time, and indeed, I don't know if she ever really had that idea, because even as a, young woman, full-time job and kids, and she'd, write her poetry until 4 o'clock in the morning, sitting at the kitchen table. So, conducted her life like a house on fire, like there was limited time. But now she felt the time was really limited. I mean, as a cancer survivor, she didn't know how much time she had left, and she articulated that even before she was diagnosed with metastatic cancer. So things that she used to do routinely, like we would all go food shopping together. She told my brother and I really clearly, look, you make a list, I'm going to take you to the shopping place, you go in there, you shop, you bring it out, I'll drive you home, you put it away. I mean, she was very clear about there are certain tasks around the house that I am not going to be spending time doing because time is limited. And, I looked around at my friends, and, their mothers, and they're like, packing up lunches and things like this. I'm like, hey, how come we can't get that kind of service at home? So, I mean, reading those books, that there was the answer to my question, why we weren't getting that kind of service at home. She had bigger fish to fry, and she was going to make sure she fried them.
So there was a shift in the relationship when you came home from San Francisco.
Yeah, I think there was. Also just the, absence makes the heart grow fonder kind of thing. I mean, she had missed the hell out of me. I had missed the hell out of her, so we had a much easier time, and also I guess the maturing process. I think 14 was probably my most obnoxious year. Too bad she's not here now. She could speak on that. But she even wrote a poem about how obnoxious I was at 14. So I think it's fair to say she'd agree with that. So.
Mm-hmm. I was just struck by your sharing about your mom working a full-time job, being a partner, raising two children, and then writing poetry to 4 a.m. It's this kind of this notion, and Tiana and I have talked about this, about like people not wanting to put in the work, but yet they want the recognition.
We did have a housekeeper
Okay.
when we were, young,
Mm-hmm.
like, 3, 4, or whatever, like in there, I remember. Shout out to Miss Maybank, wherever she is. Her name was Elizabeth Maybank. She was really helpful to my mom.
Mm-hmm. The activist work, the poetry. Like, what do you think? I mean, you can't obviously speak for Audrey. Audrey's not, but in terms of your understanding.
I think that I would separate, and my mom would hate this, but I would separate the poetry work from the activist work for the purpose of this question.
Okay.
Because Descartes said that talent does what it can and genius does what it must. And my mother was a genius. I mean, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, she was a poetic genius. And I don't think, if she had lived, a few millennia ago, she would have been scratching out poems, on the side of a cave, using a stick, and whatever the language of the time was. I honestly believe that, and if she lived a few millennia in the future, assuming the human race makes it that far, which I'm not sure that we will, but, if we manage to persist, if she lived in the year, 50,000, she'd be using whatever language is available to the human beings of that time, because she was born a poet. I mean, I really believe that. And she had to write. I mean, she had to write. And I guess in some ways, her activism, she had to do that too, although I think that sprang from a different place. I think it sprang from a lot of different places. Love and anger, and how those two things came together for her. I think where her activism came from. This absolute love for women, for black people, for children, for poor people. I mean, my mother had a love for people whom she looked around and saw that they were oppressed. And rage at those people whom she identified as oppressors. And looking at how she was raised, I mean, the roots of that may have been even, in her own mother. And how she grew up as the darkest skinned little girl in a family of 3 little girls, born to a very light skinned Caribbean mother. May she rest in peace, my grandmother Linda, whom I love dearly, but she and my mother had a very difficult, relationship. But also that activism was more of a choice. Because if there's another thing that I took away from reading those books, the year I was 16, it was this recognition that my mother was writing over and over again about feeling fear and not letting it stop her. That those feelings of fear, being afraid, or that urge to be silent, to recognize it, hello, and keep on doing what you're doing anyway, or what you feel must be done anyway. So, if I wasn't related to my mother, if I were just, black lesbian, born in 1963, happened upon the writings of Audre Lorde and found them helpful in my life, I think that's probably what I would find most helpful about all her writings. And so I do know that to say, oh, well, she had to do the activism, it was in her, because it was really a choice, that not to be silent thing.
I want to bring it back to Audre and thinking about just the groundbreaking work she did with the cancer journals, and just and in terms of healthy society, and how she made connections that now people are kind of talking about, and some folks don't even know Audre's role in just kind of the I would say just the health movement in many ways. I mean, it was, from my understanding, and please correct me, in terms of just the work that she was doing in terms of her own experiences and in writing the cancer journals at a time as when people were not talking about cancer. I mean, now, there's, ribbons everywhere, and there's Breast Cancer Awareness Month, there's discussion, there's health centers. I'm speaking to somebody without health insurance. I mean, I've been able to get free mammograms and all that. So, and I think that it is a result of a lot of struggle, but I see your mother's part of the forefront of that struggle. So just wanting to just, touch upon just with, your mother's role in making creating her role, her work towards creating a healthy society.
Well, I think a lot of it goes back to that idea that, silence is poison, and the HIV AIDS activist, silence equals death. That was an idea that was definitely germane for her. And she felt that very strongly before she had breast cancer. And I think the silence around breast cancer specifically really struck her and hit home in very sort of fundamental ways. That the silence around, as you and I were talking about earlier, people diagnosed with breast cancer, even in our families, that nobody talked about it, that it was something shameful. So all of a sudden, nobody knows the family history. There was my mother had a extended relative, who came to visit us the summer after she had had her mastectomy. And privately, this woman told my mom that she had had a mastectomy 20 years before. And she was part of the family, and my mother had never known. And nobody ever known. And so I think that the whole, yes, Audre Lorde found prosthetics personally distasteful. She didn't care for them. She did not want one for herself. But I also think that she found the way that they sort of enabled silence. Like, every woman that you see has two breasts, and you don't see any women with one breast or no breasts, because that would beg the conversation and make that silence disappear in a way that it had never disappeared. Really, even now, the whole breast cancer, and I think it's very important and positive, the changes that have gone on. So, I would never, poo-hoo that. And as a breast cancer survivor myself, I have directly benefited from the changes in breast cancer treatment. The difference between 1979 and 2004, which was the year I was diagnosed, those are pretty significant changes. But another thing that has kind of come home to me, during my work at the Adolescent Health Center is, who's healthy and who's unhealthy is such a corporate question here in America. There is so much money to be made off of people being unhealthy, in this society. And breast cancer is not an exception to that. And I think that piece of it also completely enraged my mother and became a piece of what she writes about in the cancer journals. On a personal note, I know that, there are women who still come up to me and say, I read your mother's book, and it really made all the difference to me in my journey through cancer. I couldn't read it, when I had cancer. Because, on a personal level, it just made me miss her too much. It made me miss her, and it was scary because, she didn't live. She ended up dying of breast cancer. Now, granted, 14 years after diagnosis, and, she lived 8 years with liver metastases, through sheer, it was German Heilpraktik medicine. There were a lot of reasons why she lived longer than the American oncologist thought she was going to live. But
and is that because she took it? It was like physician heal thyself. Was she kind of owning her own care?
She did. Well, that's another. She became an absolute authority on breast cancer. And when she was diagnosed, she got these oncology textbooks and Cecil's textbook of medicine, which literally is this fat, and Harrison's, which comes in 2 different volumes. And she just became an expert. She read everything. And she went to Switzerland when she was diagnosed with metastases. Because basically she was working with oncologists in New York who told her, you've got a couple of months to live. And she went to Switzerland, and from there, and I don't know how she got connected with folks in Berlin, but she became connected with a Heilpraktik in Berlin, who used a medication called Iscador, which actually is used now at Memorial Sloan Kettering. It is a mistletoe extract, and it boosts the activity of natural killer cells. And natural killer cells are kind of like Pac-Men. The Pac-Man games. They come around and they eat cancer cells. They're like, ooh, you're bad. You're a cancer cell. So that's what natural killer cells. That's their job. So Iscador boosts their activity. So, the Germans were doing this decades before us. So that was definitely a piece of what she elected to do. When she told her American doctors, this is what I'm doing, it was very hard for her to find American doctors who would still see her and work with her. Because they felt like, well, we don't approve, this is not approved medical treatment. You're killing yourself. One doctor told her, you're going to die a very unpleasant death. And, and very soon. And I don't want to see it, and basically cut her from his care. So, yeah, things have changed in a lot of ways, and I know that my mother was a piece of that. She was not there are other pieces of that, right? The women's health movement, the Boston Women's Health Collective,
National Black Women's Health Movement,
right?
Yeah.
My mother was a part of the movement that said, like Cy Sims selling the suits in New York, Sims Men's Clothing, best well-educated consumers are best customer. Well, that's kind of like, and it's never been, that actually has never been more true in medicine than it is now. Because, the piggiest, most patriarchal physician, that I had as my instructor in medical school, still held patients like this, and if you were his patient, he had your backside. End of story. Well, it's not like that. You need, I don't know if you've been in a hospital lately, but if you don't have somebody out there advocating for you, front and center, woe betide. I see that as a real problem, And it is a real problem because that also impacts on health.
Mm-hmm.
But that is definitely the way things are now.
So I want to talk about you as doctor, medical doctor, and just how did you get into the field of medicine? What made you decide to be a doctor?
Well, I wouldn't call myself a genius. Like I said, my mother was a genius, and she had to do poetry. But I do think, I think medicine chose me. And I don't know if it's past lives or whatever, but I knew I wanted to be a doctor from the age of 4 years old. Like, people would say, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I'd say, I'm going to be a pediatrician, and I'm going to take care of all the babies in my free clinic. That's what I'd say to people. And there's, in my medical school yearbook, we got to choose our own pictures and whatever, so I picked a picture of, I guess I'm about 5 years old, and I have on, the little plastic spectacles and the little plastic stethoscope, and I'm listening to some grown man's chest. I think it was probably a guest who'd come over to talk to my mother or whatever, because it's definitely not my dad. And, but I remember people coming over to the house and, he asking, are you okay? And, don't you need to be listening to their chest? I had like these little, M&Ms I'd give them for pills and stuff like that. I was sure I was going to be, every Christmas it was like another doctor kit. So, that desire really stayed with me. I do believe in past lives because I don't know where else that desire came from. And I'm classically trained, went to a great medical school, but the things that I find myself best at and most comfortable with are things that doctors were doing a very, very long time ago. Basically listening. Listening and watching and loving and holding hands and the healing power of paying attention to how someone else feels about, her, in my case, her own health, because I'm an OBGYN. It's very powerful. I, do a lot of reading, and I am allopathically trained physician. But my patients have always made me look very, very smart. Because most of the time, people know what's wrong with them. They don't have, the language that you as a doctor might necessarily use. But if you take the time to listen and to ask them, they will tell you pretty much unequivocally, in most cases, what's wrong. So, over the years, my patients have made me look really smart. And, I think that particular aspect of doctoring is a very old art. And medical schools in the United States are taking pains for the last 20 years or so to teach that. But having done a little bit of teaching myself of residents and fellows and medical students, I'm not sure that piece can be taught. I think people come to medical school with that, or they don't. And it doesn't mean they can't be good physicians, but there's a certain type of doctoring they won't excel at if they don't have that, in my opinion. It doesn't mean they can't do a lot of good. They can. And there are certain fields where that skill may get in the way. You need to crack a chest in 30 seconds. You don't have time, because that kind of doctoring not only pays attention to the patient, you're also paying attention to the patient's family and stuff like that, a lot of dynamics and things like that. There are certain fields where that may not serve you, right? So, yeah, it's interesting. But the long answer to your question,
No,
that's how
great.
that's how I came to medicine.
Yeah.
It's just this deep desire, and I have no idea where it came from.
Mm-hmm.
I ended up not going into pediatrics because I couldn't handle it. You know, in medical school, at least in those days, you spent the first 2 years studying out of books, and then you do rotations in the hospital. You'd spend, 6 weeks doing pediatrics, 6 weeks on surgery, 6 weeks internal medicine, so forth. And during my pediatric rotations, just luck of the draw, I was at Harlem Hospital, the inpatient unit, for my pediatrics inpatient training. And it was 1992. We really didn't have great drugs, especially for pediatric HIV patients. And it was 2 years before we knew that you really needed to give pregnant women AZT to cut down the risk that a positive woman would also have a positive child, like pass HIV on during the pregnancy process and especially the birth process. So 1994, which was the year that study was actually stopped early and published, what they call the vertical transmission rate, meaning from mom to baby of HIV, went from being 25% to being 8%. So in 1992, the risk that a positive woman would have a baby who also had HIV and was struggling with that illness was 25%. And the pediatric wards in Harlem were full of positive kids, and we really didn't have great drugs for them. And at that point in the game, many of them didn't live to see 5. Like, to be working with kids now, young people who are in their 20s, born positive, and they're HIV positive and they're in relatively good health and on meds, to be struggling with the question of what happens to folks chronically when they're on HIV meds for 20 years. In 1992, we never thought we were going to have to deal with that problem. We didn't know those folks were going to live. So I used to come home crying every day. And I thought to myself, these pediatricians are very special people, but I can't do this. So, yeah, I ended up not going into pediatrics. My next rotation was OBGYN. My first night on call, it was absolutely crazy. 3 o'clock in the morning, everybody else is busy. These 3 women walk in booming labor. The midwife turns to me and says, "Who are you?" "I'm Elizabeth. I'm the medical student." "Well, you come with me, because we're going to deliver this first woman together, and then I'm sending you in with my best nurse, because all 3 of these women are going to deliver in the next half hour." And it's just the way it happened. And wow, when that baby came out, oh my goodness. Wow. Put the baby on the mom's chest, clamp the cord, cut the cord, suction the baby's mouth. Oh my goodness. Wow. What a feeling. I'd never known anything like it. I was higher than a kite. It was fantastic. I was hooked. That was it. That was all she wrote.
Wow. And then you did that for how long?
Well, let's see. So you mean my rotation?
Yeah, no. So I know you were doing adolescent health. So was that still under OBGYN?
I came to that later.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk about the work that you were doing with adolescents,
Yeah.
GYN, and there were several things that I remember at the Hunter gathering, 20 years of Audre's passing in 2012. You were just sharing some really kind of startling facts around just the connection in terms of just adolescent health, but then also just what's happening in society in terms of how people are determining prisons based on people's reading levels, just how it's all kind of interconnected. I'm thinking about your sharing about just the relationship between really being good. Doctoring for you has been really about understanding people's stories and making connections. And so just really wanted to just talk about the work that you have done around adolescent health.
I think that one of the things that really stands out for me when I remember that conference is how much of celebrating my mom's work came down to this understanding of her integrating all these different pieces. The mother piece, the poet piece, the activist piece, and how they all work together, and not only made her who she was, but also informed her vision of what she saw her work as being. And working with adolescents really solidified that for me in my own life. I came to the Adolescent Health Center basically through doing some consultant work. The Adolescent Health Center was a wonderful, wonderful institution. Mount Sinai Adolescent Health Center. Angela Diaz is its director. At that point, really had a pretty big population of young ladies with what they call cervical dysplasia, meaning that there are cells that are abnormal and potentially precancerous as a result of infection with human papillomavirus. And in other words, these were young ladies who had abnormal pap smears and how to manage those. Well, okay, fast forward 10 years. Now we know that human papillomavirus is very, very common. It's almost impossible to escape having HPV. 80% of the world's population will have it at some point or another, and especially young people, because it is a time when folks get sexually active, and so they pass HPV back and forth between each other, and that typically genital HPV is something that we see very, very common in adolescents, and for the vast majority of young people, these infections are going to be transient. They go away on their own. And so at that point, and I'm talking, the early years of the millennia, it was 2004 when I came to the Mount Sinai Adolescent Health Center. We were over treating young people in large numbers. But as study on human papillomavirus advanced, we came to the understanding that not only do we not need to overtreat, but especially in early years, we don't even need to look. So we're a lot less aggressive now about doing pap smears in young women than we were in 2004. But when I came to the Adolescent Health Center, it was originally to kind of take care of this population and to do something called colposcopy, which is what you do when the pap smear has been abnormal. So I was involved with that work and did research on human papillomavirus at the Adolescent Health Center for about 8.5 years. But my main work there was just seeing kids clinically, in a clinical setting. And for most of the young people at the Adolescent Health Center, kind of reproductive health issues. I was doing adolescent gynecology, so for the most part, I really only saw young ladies. Gynecological problems of all different kinds. And also I had some teaching responsibilities. But the Adolescent Health Center, which sees patients regardless of their ability to pay, they actually don't even need identification. They just need to self-identify as being between the ages of 11 and 24 when they get to the front door. Sees a really wide gamut of young people, and especially young people who come from very constricted financial circumstances. So one thing that really became clear to me with seeing these young people was that these young people were healthy now, but these young people were the very disproportionately unhealthy 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds that I had seen when I had worked in community medicine, say at the Ryan Community Center, because where I'd been before Mount Sinai was the Ryan Community Health Center on 97th Street. Which also saw patients on a sliding scale. Mm-hmm. So a lot of poor folks. Mm-hmm. Gave great care. Mm-hmm. But again, served a population that was disproportionately unhealthy, disparately unhealthy. When you compare with, folks who are, same age, living in the same city, living in the same zip code, who have incomes that are 5 times the amount. And I quickly came to the realization that the most important question that I could ask my patients was, how are you doing in school? And if that answer was not well, or if the answer was fine, but fine meant, D's, like fine meant I'm going to the next grade. I might not know how to write a complete sentence, but I was promoted last year, if that's what fine meant. In other words, if there was any kind of constriction on this person's academic and occupational potential, that was the biggest risk to this person's health than anything else. Worse than cigarette smoking, worse than being in a car without a seatbelt, like surer to kill you more unpleasantly at a younger age than almost anything else. And I'm not the first or only person at the Mount Sinai Adolescent Health Center who had come to that realization, because during the 8 years that I was there, and even before I got there was a real push for tutoring and all kinds of integrated services, mental health services, family therapy, to really set these kids up for success in a way that was more than just, giving them vaccinations and taking care of acute health problems.
Because it's almost as if somebody's concerned about them at this age, but God help them past a certain age as well.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. I mean, where's the Mount Sinai Adolescent Health Center for people who are, 26 years old? I don't know. I mean, the Ryan Community Health Center would see folks on a sliding scale. If you're LGBT, the Callan Lorde Community Health Center serves that function. But again, very limited financial. I mean, I'm on the board of Callan Lorde Community Health Center. The whole city needs the kind of care that's given there. But, it barely, tons of fundraising goes into just letting that facility be able to serve the community that it serves. It keeps its mission sort of centered on healthcare for LGBT individuals, because, they don't have the resources to expand further. So I think that your comment is really well founded. Like, yes, where is that kind of support and real sort of individual case management, for folks who are struggling? Because that's what health really is all about. Health is multifaceted, and at the same level, if you focus on, health, and you need to have an educational piece for that. When folks are healthy and when folks are meeting their potential, you don't just have individual health, you have societal health. What does it mean for America that we have the world's largest incarcerated population? What does that say? Or that the division between rich and poor, on the streets of New York City makes Calcutta look like a tea party. Unhealthy individuals, unhealthy society.
Thank you.
Thanks. It's been great speaking with you.
It's been great speaking to you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
You. It's been good.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tiana.
Tiana.
Sorry. What did I say? Tiana?
Taina, I think.
Taina? Like Taino.
Yeah, exactly. Taino
Tiana.
Indian, yeah.
Have I been doing that all night?
I don't know. I just heard it, you know.
Have I been doing that all
You
night?
said it one other
I'm
time.
sorry.
It's okay. I mean, it's like kind of.
I'm sorry. Sit down here.
Oh, sit down. Yay! All right. Yay! Here we are. Oh, and that's it. Yeah.
Hi.
Me sitting on your lap tonight.
Yay. But they can't see that, right?
It's
because
okay.
it's just a
But
table. You know,
what's happening?
right?
Yes,
It's just
it's,
a table.
it's yeah.
Hi. Hi. To all the folks home.
Yeah. This is going on Feminist
This is
Love.
true love.
This
The
is.
Tiana came
Be
out.
alarmed. Be alarmed.
With the not quite virus and a major installation opening at the end of the week. Come on now. You know.
Wow.
Wow.
Yes.
Seriously,
Yeah.
greater
Yeah,
love
working.
for your comrades. Oh man.
Thank you,
I tell you what.
Tiana.
I tell you what.